Okay, we're back with Thomas Taylor's dissertation on Aristotle's philosophy. We've been looking at the elements, the singularity of the world, rather than many worlds, and their world means Earth, effectively, rather than the whole universe. I don't think he has any arguments about multiple entire universes. Um, Plato does in Timaeus, but all right. And now we're moving into the question of the ungenerated nature of the world, or the perpetuity, eternity of the world. Classic topic for debate. Of course, the famous dispute was between Proclus, who affirmed the eternity of the world, and John Philoponus, a Christian Neoplatonic uh, author from shortly after the time of Proclus. They didn't know each other, but John Philoponus, I think, studied in Alexandria. All right, and some of the Middle Platonists also maintained that the world had a temporal beginning. So we'll see what arguments Aristotle brings here, and I assume we'll have commentary from Simplicius again. So, Chapter 5, Book 2. We have already seen that Aristotle, at the end of his Physics, demonstrates the perpetuity of the world from the infinite nature of time. In the first book of his treatise on the heavens also, he shows multifariously that the heavens, and on account of them the whole world, are ingenerable and incorruptible, and are neither generable but incorruptible, as some appear to have said, nor ingenerable but corruptible. But and there are arguments that we've encountered elsewhere, I think in Plato specifically, in the Timaeus, that when something is capable of being generated, it's capable of being corrupted. Um, and in some sense, Plato maintains that the world is generable because it's made of stuff that is all generable. And in some sense, it is corruptible in that all the stuff it's made of is corruptible. But the reason for its not being corrupted is the good will of the demiurge. But Aristotle may take a different tack here. Okay, nor ingenerable but corruptible, but that they possess perpetuity from each part, and universally that the generable and corruptible and the ingenerable and incorruptible follow each other. Right, so when something is generable, it is corruptible. When something is not capable of being generated, it is not capable of being corrupted. Having therefore copiously demonstrated these things in the first book, he makes the conclusion of them the beginning of the second book in the following admirable manner. Aristotle, that all heaven, therefore, was neither generated nor can be corrupted, as some say, but that it is one and perpetual, having no beginning nor end of all eternity, but possessing and comprehending in itself infinite time, may be believed from what has been said, and through the opinion of those who speak otherwise, and assert it to be generated. For if it can thus subsist, but cannot subsist after the manner which they adduce, this will have great weight in procuring credibility concerning its immortality and perpetuity. Right. So, from the arguments given and also from the refutation of the contrary opinions, we'll have confidence in this conclusion. Let's go to footnote 9. And I assume this is mostly drawn from Simplicius. Footnote. When Aristotle says that the heaven has no beginning nor end of all eternity, he means the temporal extension of life. For the eternity of everything connected with time is said to be this. So eternity is used in the sense of perpetuity when discussing temporal things, very often. And this indeed is a certain image of that which is properly eternity, so far as it is in conjunction is a conjunction of the whole of life. So eternity itself is atemporal union, perpetuity, and eternity in a lesser sense is the extension. How did he phrase it? The temporal extension of life. The words also, having no beginning nor end, precedenteously indeed pertain to the body which is moved in a circle, but on account of this body, to the whole world. In short, to the heaven, having no beginning nor end of all eternity, it is accurately added that it possesses and comprehends in itself infinite time. For if it were generated from some beginning of time, it is evident that time would have an existence prior to its subsistence. And if it were corrupted in a certain part of time, time would exist after its subsistence. Right. It comprehends in itself infinite time. It's not like time is a background thing. Time is a number of motion. So if there's nothing to move, there's no time by Aristotle's definition. So time only makes sense within the motion of the cosmos. So it comprehends in itself infinite time. He renders it manifest, therefore, that time neither exists prior nor posterior to the heaven, through its possessing and comprehending in itself infinite time. For time, as Plato says, was generated together with the heaven, and therefore was not prior to it. But the infinity of time makes the extension of the being of heaven to be infinite. The infinite, however, here must not be understood according to energy, but must be considered as a procession to infinity. For such is time, having its existence in becoming to be, i.e., in a procession or tendency to being. But how, Simplicius adds, does he say that time is possessed and comprehended by the heaven? Perhaps, as Alexander thinks, because time is produced by the heaven, since time is the number of the motion of it, and there is not any time beyond the heaven, and because everything which is generated is comprehended by its generator. This, however, deserves attention, for if time is the measure of motion, and not that which is measured, it will be the cause of that which measures. And if time was generated together with the heaven, how is the motion of the heaven the cause of time? So if time is the measure of motion, it'll be the cause of the measurement. If time was generated with it, how is the motion of heaven the cause of time? I guess the implicit step is like, if time is a measure of motion, then that which is measured is the cause of that measure. Which, if a measurement is for the thing measured, then it is a goal and is more ultimate. Final cause is like the highest type of cause we've seen in Proclus. So in a more absolute sense, if measurement of time is for the motion, for the number of motion, then that motion is the end of the measurement and is the cause, therefore, of the measure. So how is the motion of heaven the cause of time if they were generated together? Doesn't that suggest a prior-posterior relationship? Perhaps, therefore, as there are many goods which give completion to the heaven and the whole world, time, in short, was produced by the demiurge as one and most principal of these, as Plato says in the Timaeus. There are many goods which give completion to the heaven and the whole world. Time was produced by the demiurge as one and the most principal of the goods that give completion to the world. Okay, we'll have to keep going. For the demiurge, says he, being willing in a still greater degree to assimilate the world to its paradigm, which is eternal, gave time to the world as an image of eternity. as it gives, therefore, completion to the world, it does not comprehend the world as some fancy, who conceive that it existed prior, or will exist posterior to it, but it is possessed and comprehended by the world, being itself a certain part which gives completion to it. Okay, so in a sense, then, there is like a prior posterior relation. The whole world is broader than time. Time is a good that gives completion to the world, it's a measure that gathers together. And this, we were just looking at Ennead 3, Tractate 5 on love, and he talks about beauty and eternity, if we recall that, and eternity measures the forms, and the first eternity measures the first beauty. So that would be the archetype of this relation between time measuring, comprehending, bringing together the world as a whole, although they're consubstantial in some sense. And likewise, in the archetypal realm, beauty and eternity go together, so that when something longs for beauty, it longs for perpetual beauty as an image of eternity, just like beautiful things are an image of the beautiful itself. So, birth in beauty, perpetuity of generation, is trying after that eternity, which is there, consubstantial at a certain level with beauty. But eternity does measure beauty up there, and yet is at the same ontological level as it, right? So then time is at the same ontological level as the world, but measures the whole world, brings it together, just like eternity measures the beautiful itself. That's the first instance of this same kind of relation. So that's all concordant. So it itself, time, is a certain part which gives completion to it. From what has been demonstrated, therefore, Aristotle says, belief may be obtained that the heaven and the whole world are ingenerable and incorruptible, and still farther from this also, that those who are of a contrary opinion, and who assert that it is generable and corruptible, are confuted. For if the truth is as we say, it will follow that it is ingenerable and incorruptible. But this will not follow, as they say, viz., who assert that it is generable and corruptible, or ingenerable but corruptible, or generable but incorruptible. If this be the case, what has been demonstrated will have great weight in procuring credibility concerning its immortality and perpetuity. But immortality is asserted of a never-failing subsistence, as we may learn from the Phaedo of Plato, or in other words, it is stability of life. The accuracy also of the words of Aristotle, in conjunction with philosophic caution, is admirable. For the conclusions made by him about the heaven and the world, that they are ingenerable and incorruptible, are not contingent but necessary. But the conclusions made by them are not possible. Hence, if it is not possible for the heaven and the world so to subsist, as they say, neither will they so subsist, except that the subversion of the opinions of others introduces the position, but not the necessity of ours. And on this account, he says, it has great weight in procuring credibility, but he does not say in procuring demonstration. What then, Simplicius adds, has not this been accurately demonstrated? To this he replies, may we not say that in those things in which it is necessary that a thing should subsist in this or that manner, he who subverts one of these modes, which is defended by others, establishes the other? So in necessary, if A, basically law of excluded middle is what's being alluded to here. If necessarily A or B and not B, then necessarily A, not A, necessarily B. If, therefore, the world can neither be generable nor ingenerable but corruptible, he evidently demonstrates it to be ingenerable and incorruptible. But if anything is established from necessity, through the subversion of other things, it cannot now be said that this is established through proper reasonings and demonstrations, for such a mode is accidental and not properly demonstrative. Okay, so that's not the demonstrative method according to Aristotle. So a reductio ad absurdum argument would not constitute a demonstration according to the Aristotelian definition of demonstration, which has to proceed from definition, after all. Okay. So we'll go back up here. So hence it will be well to persuade oneself that ancient assertions, and especially those of our ancestors, are true, and that some one of those natures which possess motion is immortal and divine, possessing indeed such a motion as to have no end, but rather to be itself the end of other motions. For end is among the number of things which contain, and circulation itself being perfect comprehends imperfect motions, and those which have an end and cessation. So the perpetuity of the world is basically argued from the circulation of the outermost heavens. That kind of motion supposedly was demonstrated to be eternal because there's no contrary to it, and generation is between contraries, and so there's no contrariety vis-a-vis the circulation of the outermost heaven. Therefore, it is perpetual. So that's where we get the perpetuity of the other motions. And he's saying that this is an ancient opinion, that all motion terminates in a first mover, basically, or an unending source of motion. This isn't quite the same as the argument for the prime mover, because he's saying, because the prime mover obviously is itself unmoved for Aristotle. But here he's at least saying that it is an ancient philosophical opinion that all motions terminate in one unending motion, although it doesn't preclude the idea of a unmoved mover beyond that. So moving on, for end is among the number of things which contain, and circulation itself being perfect comprehends imperfect motions and those which have an end and cessation. For it has neither any beginning nor end, but is unceasing in infinite time. But with respect to other motions, to some it is the cause of their beginning, but to others of their receiving a cessation. So the circulation of the heavens is the cause of the beginning and the end of the other motions. The ancients also attribute heaven and the upper region to the gods because this alone is immortal. But the present reasoning testifies that it is incorruptible and ingenerable, and besides this, that it is impassive to all mortal difficulty. And so you can say that you can see this way of talking about the outermost heavens would be coherent with Alexander's interpretation of the passage from last week's reading from chapter 4, book 2, which dealt with the question of, sorry, I'm kind of blanking real quick. Dealt with the question, oh yeah, of the beings beyond the outermost heaven. So Simplicius argues persuasively from Aristotle's text that he must have posited beings that are non-temporal, eternal beings, and associated those with divine beings. But then later on in the same passage, it seems like he shifts to the outermost heaven. Simplicius says there is a topic shift. Alexander says, no, the whole passage is dealing with the outermost heaven. And so this here, the way he's talking about the outermost heaven, could be used to justify a view of Aristotle's ontology where the gods are all within the world. Nothing is beyond the world whatsoever, except perhaps the unmoved mover. And you don't have multiple eternal beings beyond the heavens, because here he's situating like the gods in the outermost heaven. But I think we can go with Simplicius safely and say that Aristotle does indicate beings outside of the heavens. But you can see with a passage like this that there's room for a plausible enough interpretation of Aristotle where the gods are simply in the sphere of the fixed stars. Okay, so footnote. This is going to be mostly Simplicius again, but I guess like technically the writing is Taylor. Aristotle, in a manner perfectly according to art, prior to demonstrations, adduces probable reasons that the celestial body is ingenerable. And also, when he says in the first book, quote, "For all men believe that there are gods, and all men, both barbarians and Greeks, who think that there are gods, assign the highest place to a divine nature, thus conjoining the immortal with the immortal, for it is impossible it should be otherwise." And now again, after demonstration, he adds the testimony of ancient and paternal assertions in order to procure a firmer belief. For arguments from probabilities prior to demonstration give the mind greater promptitude and strength for the demonstration, yet afford a suspicion of some paralogism and demonstrative imbecility. But such like arguments after demonstrations render belief in the demonstrations more accurate, and at the same time more sympathetic. Hence, Aristotle employs them after demonstrations, as it is usual with Plato, after demonstrative conclusions to introduce fables. So I actually don't see, it seems like he's contradicting where Aristotle's introducing these probable arguments before and after. So I'm not sure, like we've already had some demonstrations from motion for the eternity of the world. So now these are the probable reasonings, I guess, and he's introducing them after them, just like Plato. And Plato does obviously argue syllogistically, dialectically, and then introduce a fable in many cases. But let's move on here. Now, therefore, Aristotle says it will be well, confiding in demonstrations, to persuade oneself still more that ancient assertions, and especially those of our ancestors about the gods, which have been delivered to us in succession from our fathers, are true. For not all ancient assertions are paternal, but those only which have been delivered from our fathers. But those especially are such which pertain to the honor and worship of the gods, because all men participating of these endeavor to preserve them immutable, as being delivered by the gods themselves. Among these traditions also is the opinion that all the celestial bodies possessing motion from themselves are natural, animated, and divine bodies, having a never-failing motion, so that there will be no end of it, and that these bodies are, as immortal, pertain to the gods. So that the sphere of the fixed stars, or I guess just the heavens in general, contain divine beings is a perennial opinion. To these assertions, therefore, he says, demonstration also bears testimony, evincing that the heaven is ingenerable and incorruptible, but that it is connascent with the human soul to think that the celestial bodies are divine, is especially evident from those who look to the celestial bodies through preconceptions about divine natures. So we can show that this is a koinai anoiai, or an element of the koinai anoiai, by looking to our experience through these innate ideas about divinity. For they also say that the heavens are the habitation of God and the throne of God, and are alone sufficient to reveal the glory and excellence of God to those who are worthy. Then which assertions, what can be more venerable? Okay. So footnote on the footnote, I guess this is actually Taylor. Simplicius, in his commentary on the first book, as well as here, quotes the Psalms of David. Interesting. And it seems reasonable to conclude from these words of David that the Jews did not, like the Christians, believe that the heavens are corruptible. Simplicius quotes the Psalms? What? Very interesting. All right. This impious opinion of the Christians has, in consequence of the Newtonian system of astronomy, become, in Europe at least, almost universal. All the celestial orbs, according to that system, being dense, heavy bodies like the earth. This making earth of heaven, however, among many other dreadful innovations of more modern times, is very far from being the way to make a heaven of earth. Okay, interesting. I like that flipping. I haven't thought of that turn of phrase, like making of heaven more earths doesn't flip around and make earth into a heaven. Okay. But it is here necessary to observe that another passage cited by Simplicius is most erroneously translated, at least according to the Septuagint version, in the vulgar translation of the Bible. Okay, this passage is in Psalm 19, verse 4, and this in the Septuagint is as follows. En to eli, I can't really make out all the characters. Effeto to okenoma auto, which evidently is, he has placed his tabernacle in the sun. That's the Septuagint. But this, in the vulgar version, we're talking about Jerome's Latin Vulgate, is, in them, the heavens, hath he set a tabernacle for the sun. Yeah, that's clearly very different. Thus, too, in the other passages alluded to by Simplicius, which is in Psalm 104, verse 5, the vulgar translation is, who laid the foundation of the earth, that it should not be removed forever. But instead of forever, it should be forever and ever, for the Septuagint is, that's not intelligible. What could induce the English translator to commit to such obvious errors? Oh, so actually the vulgar version he's talking about is, I guess, the King James. I thought he was talking about the Latin Vulgate, but never mind. Perhaps because he not only believed the world would be destroyed, but was also a Copernican. If, however, divinity made the earth so that it should not be removed forever and ever, the corruptibility of the world is not a doctrine of the Old Testament. Interesting. Okay. I want to go to ChatGPT real quick. Or actually, I could probably just do Bing Chat for this. Does Simplicius, the Neoplatonist, quote the biblical Psalms? Yes, Simplicius does quote the Psalms, for instance, in his work On the Heavens. He references the prophet David. Interesting. Okay, well, I'm going to ask, why does he quote? Why does Simplicius quote the Psalms? for several reasons. Firstly, he draws upon the wisdom and moral teachings found in the Psalms to support his philosophical arguments, so he's citing them favorably. Secondly, the Psalms often emphasize simplicity, humility, and dependence on a higher power, which aligns with Neoplatonic ideas about the soul's ascent towards the divine. Simplicius likely saw value in integrating the biblical insights into his philosophical discourse. Interesting. Very, very interesting. Although people have speculated, I think, that Simplicius on the heavens is actually someone else. Damn it. Sorry, guys. Don't mean to curse. I just had an incident here. Okay. This is unprecedented. I'll be right back. Okay. Apologies. Yeah, I was just gonna ask if the authenticity of that commentary is the authenticity of Simplicius on the heavens in question. It's not in question. Okay, well, Simplicius quotes the Psalms. Interesting. Did not realize that. So, for they also say, this is back with Simplicius's footnote, for they also say that the heavens are the habitation of God and the throne of God. So, I guess he's quoting the Psalms here, and are alone sufficient to reveal the glory and excellence of God to those who are worthy. Then which assertions, what can be more venerable? And it's interesting that he's talking about a passage where Aristotle's saying what their fathers have passed down, and he's quoting the Old Testament. Fascinating. And yet Simplicius adds, speaking of the Christians, as if forgetting these words, they fancy that more imperfect fabrications are more honorable than the heavens, and thus strive to dishonor them, as if they were made in order to injure man. But the motion of the heaven has been considered by mankind as unceasing and never failing, from its always possessing an invariable sameness of subsistence, since it is not subject to any essential change, and in consequence of reasoning from observations which have been delivered in succession. For it is not possible that anything corruptible could have remained in the same condition for such an extended period prior to the present time. So, because it's lasted so long without much change, therefore it must be incorruptible empirically or inductively. And in my opinion, the beauty of the heavens, which far surpass the beauty of sublunary natures, and the natural conversion to them of souls which have not been previously corrupted, are sufficient to produce conviction that they are divine. The energy of them also on sublunary bodies, and their containing all bodies in themselves, is sufficient for this purpose. So the heavens containing sublunary natures, by surrounding them, indicates their divinity, as well as astrological influence, indicating the same. For this also is a supernatural sign of absolute and divine transcendency, to generate all things and comprehend all things in themselves, leaving external to themselves none of their productions. But what is Aristotle's meaning when he says that the motion of heaven having no end is the end of other motions? For how is one motion the end of another, the more universal of the more partial? And how in the second figure does he appear to syllogize from two affirmatives when he says, end or boundary is among the number of things which contain? The celestial motion being perfective contains. The celestial motion being perfective, therefore, is an end. For this mode of For this mode of complication in the second figure is reprobated as not having any necessary conclusion. Aristotle, however, concludes the syllogism in the first figure as follows. So the phrasing makes it appear as though he's using a second figure syllogism, which would be invalid, but there's a valid first figure syllogism here. The motion of heaven, being perfective, comprehends other motions. That which comprehends other motions is the end of other motions, but the peculiarity of things which comprehend is to be the end of things comprehended. Indeed, that the motion of heaven, being unceasing, contains all other motions which have a beginning and end is evident, since it exists prior to and together with and posterior to them, although the universal temporal circulation becomes a certain part of the whole, being the measure of the temporal life of mortals, or of the mutation of each of them. As therefore the beginning and end of the diurnal and temporal circulation is comprehended, diurnal meaning like daily circulation, is comprehended in the whole circulation of the heaven, so likewise is each of the sublunary motions. And on this account also it is said to contain other motions, and to be the end of them, itself having no end. For the beginning and the extremities of temporal motions are bounded by the never failing, the motion of heaven being never failing, because whatever is assumed of it is not only the extremity of the past, but also the beginning of the future. But how can that ever fail in which the same thing is the beginning and end? Or how, in short, can it have either a definite beginning or end? Such then, being the motion of the heaven, to some things it is the cause of their beginning, but to others it receives the rest. It is the cause indeed of beginning, because all generation originates from it, but it is not the cause of rest, because the motion of the heaven is not properly the cause of corruption, as neither is the demiurge of the universe. But corruption necessarily accedes to things which are not able to subsist perpetually, just as disease accedes to natures which are not naturally adapted to be always well. The motion of heaven, however, receives the rest of things which are at rest. So it's not the cause of corruption, it's the cause of motion and rest, not generation and corruption. I guess it is the cause of the generation of generated natures, but it's not the cause. Similarly, how like God is not the cause of evils, so the heavens are not the cause of corruption, but they are the cause of rest, both because as the principle of motion, so likewise rest is in it. So implicit in the concept of motion, there is the concept of rest. And so as the cause of motion, implicitly it has the principle of rest in it. And especially because the corruption of one thing is the generation of another. And the elements in composites, being resolved, are returned to their wholes. Okay. So in another sense here then, it is the cause of corruption, because when it generates one thing, well, the generation of one thing is the corruption of another. So being two sides of the one coin and being the cause of the generation of one thing, it's sort of the cause of the corruption of the other, I guess. Seems like you kind of went back and forth on that idea, but Simplicius adds, and Aristotle appears to me in what he here says to signify the mandate in the Timaeus of Plato of the demiurge to the celestial gods. So Aristotle's referring to this quote from the Timaeus. Increase mortal natures by supplying them with aliment, and receive them back again when dissolved by corruption. But Aristotle, having observed that the ancients attributed heaven to the gods in consequence of its never-failing motion and immortality, subjoins that the present reasoning testifies that it is incorruptible and ingenerable to the indemonstrable and essentially natural conceptions of the ancients, adding demonstrative accuracy. Okay, so he demonstrates what was previously simply handed down. At the same time, also, he shows that it is impassive to all mortal difficulty, not that it is simply impassive, for the celestial bodies suffer something, being perfected by each other, as the illuminations of the moon from the sun clearly evince, and the different energies of different mixtures of rays on sublunary natures. But it is impassive to all mortal difficulty. So they're passive to each other, or co-passive, but impassive to sublunary natures. For thus, in the preceding book, he shows that it is unchanged in quality, denying of it passive qualities, and such as are inherent in generable and mortal natures. But it may be said, if the celestial bodies are impassive to such like affections, how is it possible that the lunar sphere, being heated by the sun, and the air also being heated by it, the lunar sphere should not be passively affected? This, Simplicius adds, well, I guess that's not included in the heavens. Would that be the solution? This, Simplicius adds, the interpreters solve by saying that not everything suffers from everything, but that only which is naturally adapted. For neither is the hearing passively affected by colors, nor the eye by sounds, but they are impassive to them. But that which happens from the marine torpedo is an evident argument that not everything acts upon everything, and that things intermediate which transmit a passion do not always themselves suffer. For when the fish falls into the net, the men that handle the ropes are benumbed, but the ropes themselves suffer nothing of this kind, because they are not the recipients of this passion. Okay, so it's a different argument. It's like just because the heavens transmit passive affections doesn't mean they themselves suffer them. The fishes also that swim over the torpedo appear to be benumbed to tend downward, though the intermediate water is by no means benumbed. It is not at all absurd, therefore, that the body of the lunar sphere should transmit the heat of the sun to sublunary natures. So the moon is not sublunary. The moon should be counted among celestial bodies. And yet, but he already established that the celestial bodies can have influences on each other. So that the moon should be heated by the sun isn't necessarily an issue, without being itself passively heated, for a certain corruption and generation. All right. I hope my mouse didn't like break. It does seem to have an issue now after an incident that I just had. Okay, it's sort of moving, so. It is not at all absurd, therefore, that the body of the lunar sphere should transmit the heat of the sun to sublunary natures without being itself passively heated. For a certain corruption and generation are always inherent in an alienation of this kind. Okay, so the reason we don't want it to be passively heated is that would be a change in quality and alienation, and corruption and generation are associated with changes in quality. In short, nothing hinders but that the lunar sphere may transmit the solar rays to sublunary natures in consequence of suffering perfectly from the sun. So it's not a passive reception. It is passive in a sense, but it's a perfect form of reception. And that sublunary natures may suffer from the rays in such a manner as they are naturally adapted to suffer, Okay, so it doesn't have the ordinary kind of alienation or change in quality. When they receive passively from each other, it's in a perfected manner. Fine. But they are naturally adapted to be heated and separated passively. For as the participations of the other stars, not being themselves hot or cold, accord to passive heat or cold, yet distribute such like dispositions to terrestrial natures, thus also the moon, being illuminated by the sun and transmitting its light to us, is not heated itself indeed passively, nor is separated by the light, but sublunary natures participate of it passively. Okay. All right. Where did we leave off? Was this all the footnote to the footnote? I guess it was. No.
Yeah.
Okay, no, that's the end of the footnote itself. So the footnote was back up here. All right. So Aristotle, but the present reasoning testifies that it is incorruptible and ingenerable. Besides this, it is impassive to all mortal difficulty. So we had that qualification of impassive. There, the celestial bodies can be passive to each other in a certain respect, but it's a perfective kind of passion that doesn't entail generation. It likewise adds, the present reasoning adds, that it is without labor because it requires no violent necessity, which, by impeding, might prevent it, when naturally adapted, from being moved in another manner. Okay, so the celestial bodies move without labor because there's no violent necessity which can impede their motion. For everything of this kind is laborious, by how much the more it is perpetual and destitute of the most excellent disposition. Hence, neither must it be admitted that it subsists conformably to the ancient fable, which asserts that its safety requires the aid of a certain Atlas. So Atlas doesn't need to laboriously hold up the world, it just stays put. For those who composed this fable seem to have had the same conceptions as posterior philosophers. So that fable is not in accordance with the most ancient and therefore most true and venerable opinion of philosophers. Interesting. So even Aristotle seems to want to default. It's not just Simplicius and Plato who want to do that, but Aristotle wants the most ancient philosophical views to be correct. For as if all the bodies on high had gravity and an earthly nature, they fabulously introduce an animated necessity as the support of the heaven. Neither, however, after this manner, nor through obtaining a circumjuration. All right, I'm going to look up that term. A circular motion, circumgyration. So neither after this manner, by being held up, nor through obtaining a circumgyration more rapid than the motion of its proper tendency, according to the assertion of Empedocles, must it be supposed that it has been preserved for such a length of time. Nor is it reasonable to think that it remains perpetual through the compulsion of soul, for it is not possible that such a life of soul can be free from pain and blessed. So the heavens themselves maintain their own perpetuity. It's not soul that constantly moves it, kind of like Atlas here. It is also necessary that the motion which subsists with violence, if it moves the first body which is naturally adapted to be moved otherwise, and if it moves it continually, must be void of leisure and removed from all intellectual facility of energy. So this is kind of interesting. It's like an argument from the like lower class nature of labor So if you're working all the time, you don't have time for intellectual activity. That's why like Plato is down on manual laborers. So the first cause of corporeal nature can't constantly move things against their natural tendency and be laborious, because then it wouldn't have time to intellectually energize. All right. So if, unlike the soul of mortal animals, it is without that same remission of the body which takes place in sleep, but the fate of some ixion must necessarily detain it, perpetual and unwearied. And I don't remember who Ixion was. In Greek mythology, Ixion was the king of the Lapiths, a tribe of strong and skilled fighters. He was known for his pride, ambition, and self-confidence, which led to his punishment. His punishment was to be bound to a winged, ever-spinning wheel of fire in Tartarus. The wheel would either spin through the air or in the underworld. In some versions of the myth, Ixion's punishment only stopped for a short time when Orpheus played his lyre. Okay. So if the soul of the universe had to constantly move the universe, and the universe wasn't itself kind of self-moved, then it would just be like a torture for the universe to constantly do that. If therefore, as we have said, or sorry, it'd be a torture for that soul. If therefore, as we have said, the first lation can subsist in the manner already mentioned, it is not only more becoming thus to conceive concerning its perpetuity, but in this way only can we unfold assertions confessedly concordant with our prophetic conceptions about the gods. But let thus much suffice at present for things of this kind. And then we have a long footnote, and then chapter 6. So we'll read the footnote next time, because we're out of time today. All right, so Aristotle basically uses like ethical intuitions in these arguments against the universe necessarily being moved from without. It has to move itself. And like I feel like the argument was there at some level too, where the first moving body ought to move according to its natural tendency and shouldn't have to be violently moved. Because elsewhere he said, like, if there was only the violent motion, like, that doesn't make sense because violent motion is defined against the natural. So the natural motion of a thing should be kind of prior to the violence against its natural motion. And so the first moving thing, the cosmos, ought to move of its own nature, and it shouldn't require like constant effort from without to keep it moving. But interesting. We'll look at the footnote next time. Any thoughts on the reading today?
Nothing from me.
Okay, I'll go ahead and